Politico Democratic presidential debate. The next question is from Tim Alberta of Politico.
Thanks, Judy. Candidates, good evening. We're going to talk about climate now. Senator Klobuchar, many scientists say that even if the U.S. reduced its carbon footprint to zero by the year 2050, the damage will have been done. The climate change will have made certain places in the U.S. unlivable. So knowing this, would you support a new federal program to subsidize the relocation of American families and businesses away from places like Miami or Paradise, California, perhaps, Davenport, Iowa, because we know these places are going to be hit time and time again?
Well, I very much hope we're not going to have to relocate entire cities, but we will probably have to relocate some individual residents. And the problem right now is that this climate change is an existential crisis. And you are seeing it here in California with the fires that you just had. You saw it in Northern California, as was mentioned with Paradise. And the most moving video from that to me was a 30-second video of that dad driving his little girl through the lapping fires with the neighborhood burning behind him and singing to her to calm her down. We cannot wait to act. There's an Ojibwe saying that great leaders make decisions not for this generation, but 7 generations from now. This president doesn't keep his decisions for 7 minutes. So what I think we need to do, get back into the international climate change agreement. I will do that on day 1. On day 2, bring back the clean power rules. On day 3, the gas mileage standards. I see the governor of California, who's been working so hard to get those done, defied every step of the way by the Trump administration, and then introduced sweeping legislation to put a price on carbon and build a fridge to the next century.
Thank you, Senator
Klobuchar. Which means we must upgrade our buildings and our building standards.
Thank you, Senator Klobuchar. Mr. Steyer, would you support such a new federal program, again, to help subsidize the relocation of these families?
Look, I am hoping that we, in fact, will do what I'm suggesting, which is declare a state of emergency on day 1 of my presidency. I have made this. I believe I'm the only person here who will say unequivocally this is my #1 priority. I know that we have to deal with this crisis. I know that we have to deal with it from the standpoint of environmental justice. I've been working on this for more than a decade. I've taken on oil companies and beaten them on environmental laws. I've pushed clean energy across this country. I've prevented pipelines, and I've prevented fossil fuel plants. But what I know is this: not only can we clean up the air and water in the Black and brown communities where our pollution is concentrated, this is also the opportunity to create literally millions of middle-class union jobs, well-paid, across the United States of America. Our biggest crisis is our biggest opportunity. And if we don't declare a state of emergency on day 1, I don't understand how we go to the people around the world to lead the coalition that has to happen and that only America can lead. Look, this is a generational question. I have a lot of respect for the people on this stage. I know everybody is worried about this, but for instance, I would call on Mayor Buttigieg to prioritize this higher, because the people in his generation understand that this is a crisis that we have to go on right now, but it's also the greatest opportunity to rebuild and reinvent America.
Thank you, Mr. Steyer. Mr. Buttigieg, 45 seconds to respond.
Well, I've made clear that this will be a topic of day 1 action, and this is not theoretical for me. I live in one of those river cities that you're talking about. Not only that, I live right by the river. My neighborhood flooded in the second of 2 once-in-a-millennium floods that we had in 2 years. Do the math on that. So I know what's at stake. And it's why I insist that we act with a carbon tax and dividend, with massive increases in renewable research on renewable energy, energy storage, and carbon storage. But bigger than that, we have to summon the energies of the entire country to deal with this. I've seen politicians in Washington saying the right thing about climate change for as long as I've been alive. All these plans we have to get carbon neutral by 2050, and I think most or all of us have one, their impact is multiplied by 0 unless something actually gets done.
We'd like to switch.
And that is why I want to make sure that our vision for climate includes people from the auto worker down the block from me in South Bend to a farmer a few minutes away, so that they understand that we are recruiting them to be part of the solution.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Not beating them over the head.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. We'd like to switch gears slightly. Vice President Biden, I'd like to ask you, 3 consecutive American presidents have enjoyed stints of explosive economic growth due to a boom in oil and natural gas production. As president, would you be willing to sacrifice some of that growth, even knowing potentially that it could displace thousands, maybe hundreds of thousands of blue-collar workers in the interest of transitioning to that greener economy?
The answer is yes. The answer is yes, because the opportunity for those workers to transition to high-paying jobs, as Tom said, is real. We're the only country in the world that's ever taken great crises and turned them into enormous opportunities. I've met with the union leaders. For example, we should, in fact, be making sure right now that every new building built is energy contained, that it doesn't leak energy, that in fact, we should be providing tax credits for people to be able to make their homes turn to solar power. Where there's all kinds of folks out here, right here in California. We're now on the verge of having batteries that are about the size of the top of this podium, that you can store energy when in fact the wind isn't blowing and the sun isn't shining. We have enormous opportunities. For example, you talk about, would we relocate people who, in fact, were in a position where they lost their homes? We have to not rebuild to the standard that existed before when we talk about when we come in and help people. We have to rebuild to the standard that exists today. For example, we shouldn't build another new highway in America that doesn't have charging stations on it. We have an opportunity to put 550,000 charging stations so that we own the electrical vehicle market, creating millions of jobs for people installing them, as well as making sure that we own the electric vehicle market. There's so many things we can do, and we have to make sure we explain it to those people who are displaced that their skills are going to be needed for the new opportunities.
Thank you, Vice President Biden. Senator Sanders.
Tim, in all due respect, your question misses the mark. It is not an issue of relocating people in towns. The issue now is whether we save the planet for our children and our grandchildren. The issue, as you should know, what the scientists are telling us is they have underestimated the threat and severity of climate change. You're talking about the Paris Agreement, that's fine. Ain't enough. We have got to, and I've introduced legislation to do this, declare a national emergency. The United States has got to lead the world. And maybe, just maybe, instead of spending $1.8 trillion a year globally on weapons of destruction, maybe an American president, i.e. Bernie Sanders, can lead the world. Instead of spending money to kill each other, maybe we pool our resources and fight our common enemy, which is climate change.
Thank you, Senator Sanders. Senator Warren, a new question to you, Senator Warren. Many of our Western allies rely heavily on nuclear energy because it's efficient, affordable, and virtually carbon-free. And many climate experts believe that it's impossible to realize your goal of net zero emissions by the year 2050 without utilizing nuclear energy. So can you have it both ways on this issue?
So I see it right now as we've got to get the carbon. We've got to stop putting more carbon into the air. We've got to get the carbon out of the air and out of the water. And that means that we need to keep some of our nuclear in place. I will not build more nuclear. I want to put the energy, literally, and the money and the resources behind clean energy, and by increasing by tenfold what we put into science, what we put into research and development. We need to do what we do best, and that is innovate our way out of this problem and be a world leader. But understand, the biggest climate problem we face is the politicians in Washington who keep saying the right thing, but continue to take money from the oil industry, continue to bow down to the lobbyists, to the lawyers, to the think tanks, to the bought and paid for experts. America understands that we've got to make change and we're running out of time, that climate change threatens every living thing on this planet. But getting Congress to act, they just don't want to hear it. And if we don't attack the corruption first, if we don't attack the corruption head on, then we're not going to be able to make the changes we need to make on climate, on gun safety, on drug pricing, on all of the big problems that face us.
Thank you.
We need a Washington that doesn't just work for the rich and the powerful. We need one that works for our families.
Thank you, Senator. Senator Klobuchar, and then I'd like to bring in Senator Yang, Mr. Steyer, for follow-ups.
Well, I wanted to add to what Elizabeth said. So the way we tackle this corruption is by winning big in this election. And the way we take on climate change in a big way is by, yes, talking about what's happening on the coast, as I just did, but also talking about what's happening in the Midwest, where I'm from. It's not flyover country to me. I live there. And what we are seeing there is unprecedented flooding. We're seeing an increase, 50% increase in homeowners insurance over the last few years. And when we make these changes, we have to make clear to people that when we put a price on carbon, that money is going to come back to those areas where people are going to be hurt, where jobs are going to change, and to make them whole with their energy bills. When you make the case like that, you bring in the Midwestern votes, you win big, and I think the best way to do it is by putting someone at the top of the ticket who's from the Midwest.
Mr. Yang, 45 seconds on the issue of nuclear energy.
Well, first, we should obviously be paying to relocate Americans away from places that are hit by climate change. We're already doing it. We relocated a town in Louisiana that became uninhabitable because the sea levels rose. And we know that town is not alone. That's playing out in coastal areas around the country. The question is, do you leave that town on its own to fend for itself, or do you come together as a country and say, we need to protect our people from climate change? Part of my plan is literally called Move People to Higher Ground, because that's what we need to do. And that's literal and figurative. Here in California, it's forest fires and forest management. On nuclear power, I agree with the research. We need to have everything on the table in a crisis situation, which this is. Other countries have had success with nuclear power, and the next generation thorium reactors have a wealth of potential. Thorium is not radioactive the way uranium is. It doesn't last as long, and you can't make a weapon out of it. If we're going to innovate our way out of this, as Elizabeth is saying, then we have to have nuclear on the table.
Thank you, Mr. Yang. The last word on climate to you, Mr. Steyer.
Look, the point about nuclear power is it's not at a stage in the United States where it's competitive on price. It has a lot of risks to it in terms of disasters, and we have no ability to store the toxins that come out of it and last 100,000 years. We actually have the technology that we need. It's called wind and solar and batteries. So in fact, what we need to do, we can do. We've got to stop taking a look at this as something that we can't do, because we can do this, and we can do it in a way that rebuilds this country on an accelerated basis, creates millions of union jobs, and we come at it from the standpoint of environmental justice. This is our greatest opportunity to reinvent this country, to actually take on the biggest challenge in history and succeed together. You want to pull the country together with all this partisanship? Let's take on the biggest challenge in history and succeed together as a nation. That's what pulls people together.
Thank you, Mr. Steyer. Amna.
Thanks, Ken. Vice President Biden.
Yes.
You've been reassuring voters that things will return to normal once President Trump leaves office, that Republicans will have what you call an epiphany and come to the table to work with the Biden administration. But given everything that you have seen from current Republicans, what evidence is there that things will change?
Look, I didn't say return to normal. Normal's not enough. Normal, in fact, we have to move beyond normal, whether it's healthcare, the environment, whatever it is. We have to build on what we had started in our administration, and that's been interrupted very badly, number one. Number two, with Trump out of the way, it's not going to change things in a fundamental way, but what it will do is it will mean that we're in a position where he's not going to be able to intimidate the base. His base is not going to intimidate those half a dozen Republicans we may need in other things. I refuse to accept the notion, as some on this stage do, that we can never get to a place where we have cooperation again. If that's the case, we're dead as a country. We need to be able to reach a consensus. And if anyone has reason to be angry with the Republicans and not want to cooperate, it's me. The way they've attacked me and my son and my family, I have no love. But the fact is, we have to be able to get things done. And when we can't convince them, we go out and beat them like we did in the 2018 election in red states and in purple states.
Thank you, Mr. Biden. Mr. Yang, I want to switch topics to you, Mr. Yang. A new question. The Democratic Party relies on Black, Hispanic, and Asian voters, but you are the only candidate of color on the stage tonight, and the entire field remains overwhelmingly white. What message do you think this sends to voters of color?
It's both an honor and disappointment to be the lone candidate of color on the stage tonight. I miss Kamala, I miss Cory, though I think Cory will be back. I grew up the son of immigrants, and I had many racial epithets used against me as a kid. But Black and Latinos have something much more powerful working against them than words. They have numbers. The average net worth of a Black household, only 10% that of a white household. For Latinos, it's 12%. If you're a Black woman, you're 320% more likely to die from complications in childbirth. These are the numbers that define race in our country. And the question is, why am I the lone candidate of color on this stage? Fewer than 5% of Americans donate to political campaigns. You know what you need to donate to political campaigns? Disposable income. The way we fix this is we take Martin Luther King's message of a guaranteed minimum income, a freedom dividend of $1,000 a month for all Americans. I guarantee if we had a freedom dividend of $1,000 a month, I would not be the only candidate of color on this stage tonight.
Thank you, Mr. Yang. Senator Sanders, I do want to put the same question to you, Senator Sanders. What message do you think?
I will answer that question, but I wanted to get back to the issue of climate change for a moment, because I do believe this is the existential issue.
Senator, with all respect, this question is about race. Can you answer the question as it was asked?
I certainly can. Because people of color, in fact, are going to be the people suffering most if we do not deal with climate change. And by the way, we have an obligation up here, if there are not any of our African-American brothers and sisters up here, to speak about an economy in which African-Americans are exploited, where Black women die 3 times at higher rates than white women, where we have a criminal justice system which is racist and broken, disproportionately made up of African-Americans and Latinos and Native Americans who are in jail. So we need an economy that focuses on the needs of oppressed, exploited people, and that is the African-American community.
Thank you, Senator. Yamiche.
Thank you, Amna. Senator Klobuchar, here in California, people who identify as Hispanic, Black, Asian, or multiracial represent a majority of the population, outnumbering white residents. The United States is expected to be majority non-white within a generation. What do you say to white Americans who are uncomfortable with the idea of becoming a racial minority, even if you don't share their concerns?
I say this is America. You're looking at it. And we are not going to be able to succeed in the world if we do not invite everyone to be part of our economy. Our Constitution says that we strive for a more perfect union. Well, that's what we are doing right now. And to me, that means, one, that everyone can vote, and that includes our communities of color. This action that's been taken by this president and his people and his governors all over the country is wrong. They have made it harder for African Americans to vote, as one court said, discriminated with surgical precision. What would I do as one of the leaders on voting in the US Senate? One, stop the purging. As Stacey Abrams said, you know, you do not stop having your right to assemble if you don't go to a meeting for a year. Because you don't go to a church or a synagogue or a mosque for 3 months, you don't lose your right to worship. You shouldn't lose your right to vote. I would pass, as president, my bill to register every kid in this country when they turn 18 to vote. That would make all of these discriminatory actions in these states go away, and I would stop the gerrymandering, in addition to the agenda of economic opportunity. Because as Martin Luther King says, what good is it to integrate a lunch counter if you can't afford a hamburger?
Thank you, Senator. Let's now turn to the issue of foreign policy and the Middle East. Senator Sanders, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo recently declared that the United States believes Israeli settlements in the West Bank do not violate international law. That broke decades-long U.S. precedent. How would you respond to Israeli expansion of settlements? Would you link that to foreign aid to Israel?
Israel has, and I say this as somebody who lived in Israel as a kid, proudly Jewish, Israel has the right not only to exist, but to exist in peace and security. But what U.S. foreign policy must be about is not just being pro-Israel, we must be pro-Palestinian as well. And whether, in my view, we must understand that right now in Israel, we have leadership under Netanyahu, who has recently, as you know, been indicted for bribery, who in my view is a racist. What we need is a level playing field in terms of the Middle East, which addresses the terrible crisis in Gaza, where 60 or 70% of the young people are unemployed. So what my foreign policy will be about is human rights, is democracy, is bringing people together in a peaceful way, trying to negotiate agreements, not endless wars with trillions of dollars of expenses.
Thank you, Senator. Mayor Buttigieg.
What we are seeing in the Middle East and around the world are the consequences of this president's failure, this president's refusal to lead. It's particularly disturbing in the case of Israel because he has infused domestic politics, making U.S. foreign policy choices in order to effectively interfere in Israeli domestic politics, acting as though that somehow makes him pro-Israel and pro-Jewish while welcoming white nationalists into the White House. But it's not only in the Middle East that we see the consequences of the disappearance of U.S. leadership. We see among our allies and among our adversaries, case after case, where the world is making plans on what to do, ignoring the United States because we're no longer considered reliable. It's not just the mockery at a cocktail party on the sidelines of a conference. It was the looks on the faces of the leaders at the UN as they looked at the United States president with a mixture of contempt and pity. As an American, I never again want to see the American president looked at that way by the leaders of the world. The world needs America right now, but it can't be just any America. It has to be one that is actually living up to the values that make us who we are, supporting peace, supporting democracy, supporting human rights, and supporting stability around the world.
Thank you, Mayor Buttigieg. Senator Warren, President Obama pledged to close the detention camp at Guantanamo Bay, but could not. 40 prisoners remain there. Last year, U.S. taxpayers paid $540 million to keep Guantanamo open. Would you pledge to finally close the detention facility? And if elected, how will you do it?
Yes, it's time to close this detention facility. It not only costs us money, it is an international embarrassment. We have to be an America that lives our values every single day. We can't be an America that stands up and asks people to fight alongside us, as we did with the Kurds in fighting ISIS, and then turn around in the blink of a tweet and say that we're turning our backs on the people who stood beside us. After that, who wants to be an ally of the United States? We have to be an America that understands the difference and recognizes the difference between our allies, the people who will work alongside us, and the dictators who would do us harm. And we need to treat our allies better than we treat the dictators. That needs to be our job as an America. We have the finest military on earth. All three of my brothers served. And we have people on this stage who have served, and I'm deeply grateful for that. Our military is strong and important, but we need to be an America that relies on our State Department, that relies on diplomacy, that relies on our economic power, and that relies on working together with the rest of the world to build a world that is sustainable environmentally and economically for everyone.
Thank you, Senator Warren. Vice President Biden, why couldn't you close Guantanamo Bay? Why couldn't the Obama administration close
We
Guantanamo
attempted
Bay?
to close Guantanamo Bay, but you have to have congressional authority to do it. They've kept it open. And the fact is that we, in fact, think it's the greatest, it is an advertisement for creating terror. Look, what we have done around the world in terms of keeping Guantanamo open, or what Trump has done by no longer being an honest broker in Israel, there's no solution for Israel other than a two-state solution. It does not exist. It's not possible to have a Jewish state in the Middle East without there being a two-state solution. And he has played to all the same fears and all the prejudices that exist in this country and in Israel. Bibi Netanyahu and I know one another well. He knows that I think what he's doing is outrageous. What we do is we have to put pressure constantly on the Israelis to move to a two-state solution, not withdraw physical aid from them in terms of their security. And lastly, I think that Senator Warren is correct. We have led by not the example of our power, but the power of our example. And the example we're demonstrating now is horrible. It's hurting us badly.
Thank you, Vice President Biden. Judy?
I want to turn to another part of the world, and that's China. Mayor Buttigieg, you have said that you think China presents more of a challenge than do your fellow candidates believe. The U.S. clearly wants China's cooperation on human rights, on climate change, on North Korea, on terrorism, and yet Americans are appalled by China's record on human rights, including the detention of over 1 million Muslim Uyghurs. Should the U.S., is my question, do more than protest and issue sanctions? Should the U.S., for example, boycott the 2022 Beijing Olympics?
I think that any tool ought to be on the table, especially diplomatic, economic, and social tools like what you're describing. Look, for the president to let it be known that his silence, whether it's on the rounding up of Muslim Uyghurs in Xinjiang, putting them into camps, or the aspirations of the people of Hong Kong for democracy, for him to let China know that his silence can be purchased is trashing American values. The reality is that there's a lot more to the relationship with China than who's selling more dishwashers. Yes, we need a much smarter trade policy. We also have to acknowledge what's going on over there. The use of technology for the perfection of dictatorship. That is going to require a stronger than ever response from the U.S. in defense of democracy. But when folks out there standing up for democracy hear not a peep from the President of the United States, what message is that sending to the Chinese Communist Party? The message I will send is that if they perpetrate a repeat of anything like Tiananmen Square when it comes to Hong Kong, they will be isolated from the free world, and we will lead that isolation diplomatically and economically.
Mr. Steyer, many Americans have been moved in the last months by the protests of the people of Hong Kong. It is Chinese territory, but what would you do as president if the Chinese government moved in militarily?
Look, there is a temptation, particularly for this president, to try and answer that in a bilateral way. The way the United States should be reacting in Hong Kong is by gathering our coalition of democracy and freedom-loving partners and allies to push back. In fact, when we're making moral statements around the world, it should not be us threatening and trying to be the world's policeman. It should be us leading on a value-driven basis with the other people who share our values and want to change the world. We actually can't isolate ourselves from China. In fact, we have to work with them as a frenemy, people who disturb us, who we disagree with, but who, in effect, we are linked to in a world that is ever getting closer. And in fact, if we are going to treat climate as the threat that it is, we are going to have to partner with the Chinese. They are going to have to come along with us. They're going to have to trust us. And together, we're going to have to solve this problem. So the ability to say it's off the table, we need a good relationship with them, and we're going to have to work with them going forward under all circumstances.
Thank you, Mr. Steyer. Vice President Biden, on China, we now know that China is engaged in an unprecedented military buildup. They have just launched a new aircraft carrier. There are new signs of their disturbing espionage campaign here inside the United States. There are a number of disturbing signs from the Chinese. National security scholars have long warned about the historical precedent that when there's a ruling power and a rising power, there's likely to be a war. Is the U.S. on a collision course with China? What steps could you take as president?
It's on a collision course with China, but not for a war. What we have to make clear is that we, in fact, are not going to abide by what they've done. 1 million Uyghurs, as you pointed out, Muslims, are in concentration camps. That's what they are right now. They're being abused. They're in concentration camps. And what we started in our administration that Trump stopped, we should be moving 60% of our sea power to that area of the world to let, in fact, the Chinese understand that they're not going to go any further. We are going to be there to protect other folks. Secondly, we, in fact, should make sure that we begin to rebuild our alliances, which Trump has demolished with Japan and South Korea, Australia, and Indonesia. We, in fact, need to have allies who understand that we're going to stop the Chinese from their actions. We should be gone to the UN immediately and sought sanctions against them in the United Nations for what they did. We have to be firm. We don't have to go to war, but we have to make it clear this is as far as you go, China. And in terms of their military buildup, it's real, but it would take them about 17 years to build up to where we are. We're not looking for a war, but we've got to make clear we are Pacific power and we are not going to back away.
Mr. Yang and then Senator Klobuchar.
I have family in Hong Kong. I spent 4 months there, and seeing what's happening on the streets, it's shocking. They banned face masks in Hong Kong. Why? Because they have AI technology that now is using facial recognition to identify protesters if they so much as do anything on the street, so they can follow up with them and detain them later. This is the rivalry that we have to win where China's concerned. They're in the process of leapfrogging us in AI because they have more data than we do, and their government is subsidizing it to the tune of tens of billions of dollars. I have sat with our leading technologists, and they say they cannot match the Chinese resources. China just produced its first major smartphone that does not have Google apps, and it is now trying to export its technology to the rest of the world. What we have to do is build an international coalition to set technology standards, and then you can bring the Chinese to the table in a very real way, because this is their top priority, and this is where we need to outcompete them and win.
Senator Klobuchar.
When it comes to foreign policy, I think we need to keep our promises and keep our threats. And this president has done neither. And a country like China, their leaders, they watch that and they know. He has stood with dictators over innocents. He has stood with tyrants over free leaders. He does it all the time. And I have a little different take than some of my colleagues when it comes to what happened at that conference with NATO. Yeah, they were making fun of him, some of the foreign leaders. I've heard senators make more fun of other senators than that. The point of it was that he couldn't even tolerate it. He is so thin-skinned that he walked. He quit. America doesn't quit. So if we want to send a message to the Chinese, we stand with our allies. We stand with them firmly. We have a very clear and coherent foreign policy when it comes to human rights. Check out my website, amyklobuchar.com. I have the 5 R's of our foreign policy about reasserting our values, rejoining international agreements like the Iranian nuclear agreement, but it all comes down to 1 R, returning to sanity.
Mayor Buttigieg, and then we're going to take a break.
I'm actually not worried about the president's bad sense of humor when it comes to being made fun of. I'm worried about the fact that he is echoing the vocabulary of dictators around the world. When the American president refers to unfavorable press coverage as the product of the enemy of the people, democracy around the world gets weaker. Freedom of the press, not just here at home, but around the world, gets weaker. It's one more reminder of what is at stake, not just here at home, but for world history, in the imperative that we win this election.
Could I respond?
This is our chance.
Very brief.
I just want to make very clear, Mayor, that the freedom of the press is deep in my heart. My dad was a newspaperman, and I am the one that asked every attorney general candidate we've had under Donald Trump, both of whom I opposed, about their respect for the First Amendment. And they have refused to follow the rules that Attorney General Holder put in place when it came to protecting our journalists. They would not commit that they wouldn't put a journalist in jail for doing their job. So this is not just talking points to me. This is the real world. And I think that experience that I will bring to the White House with protecting the First Amendment is worth more than any talking points.
We are going to take a short break, and we'll be right back with more questions.